Coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
How did you get big tech in the first place? Well, it was the Obama administration waving through every single merger and acquisition that came across its desk because, as a matter of national security and geopolitics, they wanted to build big tech. They wanted to use it as an instrument of statecraft, and that's exactly what happened. And here we are confronting the fact that all of our communications and economic activity has basically been centralized in the hands of a few institutions that are basically arms of the state. These institutions are at serious risk because if Taiwan gets taken off of their table, then there are going to start being major shortages of chips and motherboards and things that they desperately need. And all this stuff radiates all the way down toward the ordinary American who's not living out in the sticks. How those Americans are going to mobilize, you have 3 million, whatever it is, Trump voters in California, not effectively mobilized. And this pattern repeats itself elsewhere. So, yeah, important to shed that spotlight on this latest cycle of decay in cities. But if there isn't a real alternative to what's being prepared for us, people are going to say, this sucks. Please just wipe it all away and replace it with something else.
Hello and welcome once again to the Roundtable, your weekly publishers and editors podcast here at The American Mind. I'm your host, Spencer Clavin, features editor of The American Mind and associate editor of the Claremont Review of Books. I am joined this week by managing editor Seth Barron and editor James Poulos. By the time I get to the end of introducing everybody, I always have a hard time saying the word editor, which has a lot of different consonants in it. So there's your fascinating fact for the day. Let's leap into the news. We've been kind of going down some rabbit holes lately, which I found really fun. This time around, we are going to talk about the kind of top line item, at least on my news feed, and that is Tucker Carlson's discussion of revelation of new video from January 6th. So House Speaker Kevin McCarthy handed over to Carlson and his team a bunch of footage that hasn't been seen before. And this is kind of the House Republicans' answer in some ways to the January 6th committee, which was this sort of glitzified, insofar as politics is ever glitzified, investigation, sort of, some might say show trial, into this whole event as if it were like the new Reichstag. And Tucker is putting out this stuff basically as a counterweight, it seems to me, to the state approved narrative, which is now basically that nothing you can say about January 6th is bad enough. It was an insurrection, it was fatal, it was armed, it was just it was carnage, massacre, whatever. We're going to get into some of the coverage of this stuff, but let me just try to summarize some of what Carlson is saying about the footage and what footage he's put out here. And this is stuff that some of it, as I understand, was not even revealed to the lawyers of the people involved. So I'm thinking specifically here of the QAnon shaman, Jacob Chansley. And if you've seen any footage of this whole day, you've definitely seen this guy. This is bare-chested. I think he had a Viking helmet on, Trump flag, walking around. And this footage shows Capitol Police officers kind of following him around and not really acting too concerned about the idea that he might be in the Capitol building. They try to open some doors for him. The point of this being this was not the horrified. So, well, actually, let me lay out a range of possible implications that one might take from this, because I think there are many. One is that this was not the chaotic Ragnarok event that it was made out to be, and in fact, a lot of the time, this was all sort of under control. I would say that would be a minimalist position. A maximalist position would be this shows that he was in cahoots with the Capitol Police, and that this whole thing was basically a staged demonstration, a staged performance that was orchestrated by the left to make the right look bad. And there are, I'm sure we'll get into talking about any number of interpretations sort of in between those two polls of what this footage is supposed to show. Likewise, the two deaths that have been most sort of famously associated with this event were revisited in this footage. You have Ashley Babbitt. These two deaths take place kind of on two different sides of the conflict, right? You've got the Capitol Police officer who died, and Ashley Babbitt, the rioter, protester, again, your mileage may vary, who died. Babbitt was shot in the shoulder by Officer Michael Bird. Sicknick died. It was later concluded of natural causes, but a blow to the head was sort of initially, in the initial fervor as the narrative was coalescing, this was one of the deaths, that they were supposed to have killed this Capitol Police officer. Carlson shows footage that he had a helmet on and was kind of like doing fine for a while after the attack, and so his claim here is that Sicknick was being used as a prop in this narrative. So we are going to get into, I'm sure, our own personal brand of conspiracy theory. How conspiratorial are we? Do we feel about this event? But we didn't want to talk just about that because, at least from my perspective, like this is kind of an unresolvable question, and that is why really the event is so interesting, and why Carlson's kind of approach to it is so interesting, is because it has been made into an unresolvable question by the fever pitch of hysteria around it, by the drama and of the associations, and also by the fact that so much of this stuff is kind of not available to the public. It hasn't been available to the public. There is a resource. I mean, some of the stuff that would be like the counter narrative on this is on ProPublica. You can see a lot of like phone footage and stuff from some of the more chaotic and aggressive. I guess it's not violence when you break a window, but sort of dramatic events from the day. The other side of this is that Tucker Carlson is now the subject, as he sort of every so often is, of like, just as you cannot say anything that is too awful about January 6th, you also can't possibly say anything that is too awful about Tucker Carlson. I mean, this is one of those things where the headlines will say, like, Tucker Carlson's false claims about these issues. And I want to read a paragraph here from one of the CNN pieces. This is actually, from the AP. Carlson is reviving the falsehoods launched by Trump and his allies, including Republicans in Congress, that the attackers were peaceful protesters and acted like tourists, despite the well-documented carnage of the day and the deaths of 5 people in the riot and its aftermath. It's part of an effort to reverse criminal charges for those being prosecuted in the attack, many of whom have pled guilty until they regretted their actions on January 6th. I want to get back into that figure of 5 people who died. I also want to talk about the fact that I'm embarrassed to say that I had sort of missed this whole thing, that like Mazie Hirono was out here for a while saying this was like an armed insurrection. And by armed, it turned out she meant like the flags that people were carrying, that they could beat people with flags somehow, or that they intended to use these as weapons. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer got out here and said Carlson is perpetuating the big lie, which, by the way, is a line he seems to have stolen, in my view, from Darius I of Persia, who accused those who opposed his world regime of being servants of Drauga, the lie. The big lie, eroding our democracy. I mean, the kind of just over-the-top reaction is kind of, to me, this is the story. The story is that what we're seeing here is a battle of narratives in which the full force of the government is on a totally bonkers side of the narrative construction, which is that this was basically the Reichstag. This was an armed insurrection. We came within a hair's breadth of these people raping and pillaging and destroying our democracy. I'm going to open this. I've talked already too much, so I'm going to open this up to the gang. But after my main question sort of on the table, I guess, is like, after all the toss and turn that is associated with this, after everybody calls everybody the most insane name they possibly can, is the needle going to move at all here?
That's kind of a good question. I don't know. I think some people, I mean, even if you're a hardcore insurrection believer, I think it's hard to look at some of that footage of people just sort of milling around, particularly the business with the QAnon shaman being escorted by a couple of cops, who are trying to get him into the Senate chambers, which was totally bizarre. I don't see how you can look at that and not have wonder what's going on. You know, it's funny listening to the rhetoric around this, like this should not be seen.
Yeah.
Why was
right.
this ever released? This is not fit for public. You know what it reminded me of? Like Claude Lanzmann, the guy who made Shoah, you know, the documentary. I remember one time he wrote something interesting about whatever, the Holocaust and film and memory. And he said something like, if there was footage from inside the gas chamber, he would want it destroyed. Like he wouldn't want it to be seen. That's kind of the attitude that we're hearing from like Chuck Schumer and people like that. Not so much like the funny thing is they want the most horrible, the horrific parts to be seen. They just don't want the other parts to be seen. They're acting as though people like need to avert their eyes from this because it's so triggering. But what they're not talking about the stuff that they showed endlessly, like people, you know, fighting and pushing in. Like the horrible stuff is just like the banal stuff. Like that's like, you know, that's kind of like the empty center of all of this is that nothing was really happening. And that's what you have to like, that's the abyss that you cannot stare into. The fact that this is all like essentially like a Hollywood movie, that it's all like a setup. It's nonsense. I don't know. I mean, hearing the White House and the Senate condemn Tucker Carlson and say that he should be fired, that he should not be permitted to put this on the air, that this should not be seen. What are they talking about? It's crazy.
Well, right. I mean, that part of it is like that is why, to me, that is the story. I think this point is really good, Seth, about like the actual sort of deflating, depressing thing for all parties, whether you like wish this were more of an insurrection or whether you think it was an insurrection and you feel it was the death. The actual deflating and depressing thing is to realize that, like, at the end of the day, these guys were kind of a bunch of losers and weirdos that have been put into this position of like insane that they cannot possibly fulfill. I mean, you know, my take on this, which kind of crystallized in the weeks and months after the event, and it really has not moved that much, was like, this was a bad thing to do. They shouldn't have done it. It looks like there were some really hairy moments in there. And also, I'm done talking about it. Like, I'm just done sort of like clutching my pearls and condemning it. In part because now it just seems like all the power, all the narrative construction is on the side of like a total fantasy. Lomez had an interesting point. One of our sued friends on Twitter had an interesting point that like the narrative construction that they used this for was basically a counterbalance to erase the summer of riots and carnage that was 2020, and that this would be just like they would just inflate this so big that it would blot out every other perception. And so in that respect, like more than anything, looking at this Carlson footage, my reaction is like, yeah, there was a lot of this part of this that was actually kind of just like shambolic and nobody quite knew what was going on. Low key, like, I mean, you guys can tell me if you think that like actually there was a grand plot on the other side going on, that like all the Democrats were sort of in on it. That's really not my sort of read on it, but I just think like looking at this stuff as sort of as you're saying, Seth, and realizing that it isn't in fact like a cataclysmic event, but is actually just kind of like a embarrassing and bad thing that happened. That's kind of where I'm falling on a lot of this.
Yeah, where do you begin? I mean, we've got guys rotting in prison without charge. We've got Mitch McConnell saying that no, it is the videotape that is wrong. It is the official report that I stand by. People do not want it to be true, and you know, there are a number of folks on the right on Twitter and elsewhere over the past several years, really just sort of patting themselves and each other on the back and joking that the left can't meme. And it's like, well, what do you think you're living in? You're actually living in an enormous meme that has been created.
With like real consequences.
Real consequences, yes. And we're starting to hear a lot about anarcho-tyranny these days, about the creepy compatibility of low-level anarchy and how it sort of works as a petri dish or a farm league for the tyrants. But what we've got right now is an anarchy of tyrannies, of factions jockeying for whatever kind of control or mastery they can achieve over various parts of this federal monstrosity. It's quite clear that the Russia hawks and the China hawks are struggling for control and mastery on the foreign policy front. It's quite clear that the highest ranking big tech people and the highest ranking federal regulators are wrestling for control over the strategic technological infrastructure of the country. It's clear that different factions of Democrats are struggling for control over the administration and whatever successor to the sitting figurehead president there is going to be. And it's clear that there are struggles within, of course, the GOP at the upper level as well. And that's scratching the surface. We've got how many federal agencies devoted to various aspects of military and intelligence? It is chaos. And if we got to see behind that curtain, I am quite sure that what we see would scare the hell out of a lot of people. Not just because, Ma writes, although, yes, our constitutionally guaranteed form of government has been taken away from us openly, but simply because there is no final center of power and authority right now. And not even in a that's checks and balances. I mean, those are gone too. Congress has just delegated away its authority. The presidency is an empty shell. The executive branch is a behemoth that's fractured and set against itself in many ways. The judiciary is rotten in its own special way. And our allies abroad, some of them are clearly working as hard as they can to draw us into a full-blown global war. So the situation is bad. It's very bad. And so there are powerful incentives for people with some degree of sway over major media institutions, major political institutions, to push the attention of the American people into the petty details of these never-ending scandals. Oh, well, was this person in this particular location, and were they being escorted, and were they a scary figure or a dangerous figure or a fascist? Just all these kinds of almost metadata about these figures and events. Something that people who are lost and confused and alarmed in a sea of information that seems to be arrayed against them can cling on to and perhaps obsess over, and so be politically neutralized even more than they already are. And meanwhile, this vast transformation that's being worked on us and on the West rolls on outside the reach of citizens, and in many cases of elected officials. This cannot continue for much longer without profound consequences. And in fact, even if for some reason all these people took a break and set their pencils down for a weekend, there would still be profound consequences. They are coming, and people just need to prepare themselves mentally for that.
This whole business about what I've seen a few places, it's why wasn't any of this footage provided to the defense for the QAnon shaman? Why didn't they use this? And then I've heard this this great explanation. People say, oh no, you don't understand. It's a separation of powers question, because they're being prosecuted by the DOJ, which is under the executive branch, but Congress owned all of this footage, so they can't be compelled to give it up. So that's why all this bogus prosecution, abusive prosecution was allowed to happen. I mean, the idea that hiding behind the Constitution in order to justify a complete, like, wanton, like, abuse of individual right, everything that underwrites, like, our sense of the American legal system. It's like, no, you don't understand. If Congress thinks that they don't want to give over the evidence, then I mean, maybe some lawyer would explain this to me in a way that makes, like, sense, but it just sounds crazy. Yeah, I think, you know, we're at, like, Guantanamo level, like, lunacy. I think it's very frightening.
Yeah, that is one of the details that most stuck out to me too, Seth. And right, like maybe there's some actually legitimate. I mean, the whole thing about sort of lawyerly reasoning that drives people insane is when it rests on technicalities that obviously defy or pervert the intended justice of the law. Like when you have some rule that's in place for a reason that seems good, and then that rule is invoked like in its letter to deny what is obviously supposed to be the spirit of the law. And that does sort of, that explanation sounds like that to me. It sounds like, well, I mean, shouldn't this guy, like, I mean, people get fair trials in this country, or that's the idea. Shouldn't he have access? Shouldn't his lawyers have access to all the footage? And yeah, the answer is just like no. It's actually you're so double plus ungood bad that you don't count as, because you're actually an enemy of our democracy. This does like, it is very, very difficult for me to get head up about anything other than that, since that is just that disaster, the disaster that James is kind of talking about, that's going on in slow motion before our eyes. Like, it's just so much worse than anything else. It's sort of like when, there's all this controversy online right now about, Matt Walsh said this and Michael Knowles said that about transgender people, or this about Dylan Mulvaney, or about like, trans kids or whatever. And it just is really hard for me to like parse any of that or care about it or get incensed, not only because I basically agree with them about this trans issue, but also because it's like when you're mutilating children, I'm just not going to set my hair on fire. Somebody like engages in loose talk, and that is kind of on the same level here. Like we can get in the weeds, we can argue about this or that like piece of footage. And I'm sort of skeptical even of doing that in the conservative mold, simply because what is obviously happening is that a total constructed, confected idea is being used to destroy people for, in ways that are totally illegitimate constitutionally. I think we've spent like basically enough time on this. I end up from our conversation feeling like actually the needle is not moved, and that people would be better served kind of reflecting on how to just wrest back control from these narrative mongers, these sort of like meme lords that are ruling us, than in like endlessly litigating this. Like, oh, gosh, it just feels hard to get anything out of this, except like there is a there is a lie, there is a big lie out there, and it is actually not about whether Trump won the election or not. Like that stuff is kind of, we're past that. I mean, who knows? It may resurface very soon in the election, but I think we'll leave it at that for now, and then we'll turn to kind of something a little bit maybe more enjoyable to talk about. I'm not sure. It does involve the collapse of New York, but there's this new movie coming out. I think March 21st. It'll be streaming. It's called Gotham: The Rise and Fall of New York. Our very own Seth Barron is one of the experts interviewed in this history of New York. It really, what I got out of it was mostly focused on Giuliani's first term and the turnaround, but it goes back before that and extends on after that. It's a really cool film. I have seen it in screener form, and I got to chat with the director, Matt Taylor, who said some great stuff. You can find that at AmericanMind.org. But I wanted actually just to kick it over to you, Seth. I mean, this is like your bailiwick. This is your wheelhouse in a lot of ways. And you I don't know if you've ever done something like this quite before, been an expert on a documentary, but was there something, revisiting this material where we are about at the American Mind to run a bunch of stuff on the future of the American city? Was there something that emerged from this experience of revisiting it that kind of made you think about it in a new light, or what did you take away from it?
It was fun being interviewed for a film as opposed to like being on television or something, or doing a podcast or being on the radio. Just sort of being allowed to talk at length, and then knowing that they would just edit it as they needed to. Yeah, it was interesting. I mean, I sort of see what they mean about all the best stuff was left on the cutting room floor. Like I had some good jokes that didn't make it in, but no, it was interesting. It did give me a chance to think about the last 50, 60 years of New York in a way I hadn't really considered before. I mean, the movie is, it's not just me, obviously. It's got all kinds of experts and people talking about how New York came back, and just thinking about, there's a certain sadness to the idea that the city was in terrible, terrible shape and then rebounded, and what the various factors were behind that. And now we really seem to have lost the plot. I mean, a theme that I kind of talk about a lot in like whatever work or when I give talks about it is that the progressives in New York who took over around the time de Blasio came into power have systematically upended like the toolbox by which the city was saved. They destroyed the mechanics of public safety. So effectively, even if we had like a new Rudy Giuliani or some true law and order mayor, in a way they would be kind of hobbled. Like it would actually be very difficult to do what Giuliani did because the tools are gone. Stop and frisk. There's been a whole like decriminalization of quality of life offenses. The same kind of having these Soros prosecutors in office who basically just aren't going to prosecute certain crimes. And this is the same thing we're seeing. I mean, what I like about the movie is that it's not just, the movie's about New York, but certainly it's a lesson for people in, cities everywhere around America, which are having like major, not every city, but many cities are having like major issues now, especially on the West Coast, but not just the West Coast. I mean, Chicago is having a terrible time with crime. So it's an interesting, look, I'm in it, so maybe I'm being partial, but the guy who made it, Matt Taylor, and his wife, Michelle, did a beautiful job. I mean, they are so committed. They walked every block in Manhattan. They walked every single street in Manhattan. It took them a couple of years, like coming back and forth. I think it's like hundreds of miles.
Yeah. Some of them, like you're taking your life in your hands. So.
Well, maybe not. But and they're very, very smart, very, very creative. It's a very good movie. It's not just like your average like PBS style documentary. It's got some stuff in it that you wouldn't find elsewhere.
No, I agree about that. And I, as somebody who is not in any way like an urban policy wonk, I feel like I learned a great deal from it. I have a lot of different things that I want to ask you about just in sort of what you just said. One thing that Matt Taylor said when I interviewed him that I found really interesting is I said to him, like, my kind of takeaway from this movie is like, wow, Mayor Giuliani, really, like, one mayor can make such a big difference. And he said, Seth, kind of what you said almost in reverse, which is like, okay, yeah, but think about this incredible like structural change that happened in the city before Giuliani. And that was the disbanding of the Board of Estimates so that the mayor, right, like structurally now has this kind of unilateral power that he's never had before. And he doesn't have to do these backroom deals or rely on the, the boroughs and all of that. And so that's kind of the same point in some ways, that this stuff, you can turn things around with a good mayor. A good mayor can do a lot, but also the way that the left often works is by installing like machines or rules that make it impossible, even when the people want to reform, to cut back crime, to, just when it gets so bad that people recognize like we just need to clean up the streets. Sometimes there's like real blockage to that's put in place by vested interests. I mean, two examples that spring to mind. One Matt himself raised, and that is Eric Adams. He sort of argued, people voted for Adams because they wanted a return to, they thought they were getting like a little bit more of a pro cop, like after the craziness of 2020, they've said, oh, we went too far. Now we're, rolling that back. And they just did not get that in Adams at all. So it doesn't actually matter that there was like an appetite for reform when the sort of when the people available, sort of the slate of options was so poor. And then the other thing that comes to mind that we didn't talk about, but I'd like to get your take on, is this whole thing that's going on with Biden in DC. Have you been following this at all?
Yes,
the crime bill.
Bit,
yeah. I mean, so the DC Council, over the mayor's objections, has done this stuff like, they've passed a bill, reducing sentencing laws, just further rolling back the already kind of meager protections for law-abiding citizens. And now Biden is saying that he'll sign the Republicans' resolution to override DC's bill. And this is sort of an issue for Biden himself, because he's sort of supported home rule for DC, but in fact now he sort of seems not to. But anyway, it just seems like an interesting little morality tale about like it's one thing to think like you live in a country where you elect your leaders and you vote for your laws, but actually there's like kind of a lot more to it than that.
Well, both with Eric Adams and Biden, I mean, I think what we're talking about, and then, if you look at Chicago and what's happened there with the mayoral race, I think what we're seeing is that is a fault in the Democrats' armor as they're looking forward to 2024, which is that they are the pro-crime party, but or the party of defund, and they want to keep that up, but they have to make some noises about public safety. So it seems like Biden is trying to. I mean, I think that's why he's making these noises about like blocking the because I guess the way DC works, technically DC is still under the control of Congress. I mean, which is weird given that they have electoral votes, but Congress can still step in and overrule what they do. So it's kind of interesting. But I mean, I guess he needs to position himself as tough on crime. Like here, I'm willing to and he's certainly not going to lose DC's 3 electoral votes over it. Adams had to sort of put himself forward as, I mean, he is a former police captain, but a lot of cops saw him as a I guess you'd say a fake cop in a way. Like his whole career, he made his whole career just suing the police, agitating against the police, complaining about racism in the police department. And while he does have a certain, respect for law and order that many Democrats in New York City do not have, he's not a Giuliani. He's not an effective mayor. So that's a problem. I don't know what you guys make of the Chicago mayoral election, but clearly Lori Lightfoot, I mean, I'm assuming that crime is what got her kicked out of office. What happens with the runoff is another question. I don't really know. I mean, I guess she has one person who's more conservative and one person who's more liberal, and how that's going to shake out, I don't know.
I mean, much like the January 6th stuff, the most interesting thing to me about the Lightfoot phenomenon is the way the press and the sort of cathedral, or whatever you want to call it, the powers that be are reacting to it. Like, that seems like a big deal that they got Lightfoot out. And yeah, my read of it is that it's about the crime. This is a theme also in the movie, and it's one of the insights that Matt highlighted that you can take away from New York and apply to all these other cities, as in a minute I'm going to ask us to think about in a second. But it's like wherever you are, if you are, and whatever kind of political color team jersey you previously were wearing, if you walk out on the street of what is supposed to be a first world metropolis and you fear for your life, or you feel like there's a serious chance that you might be raped in certain neighborhoods, I mean, all this stuff before the 90s in New York, this stuff got really bad. And, you know, of course, there were also race riots to that then as now. And, you know, once people meet up with that at a certain point, they just don't like it. And except for in the kind of high octane, high rhetoric political world, it's pretty commonsensical to just say, like, we shouldn't be doing crime all the time. We shouldn't be allowing that all the time. And so, yeah, it seems like that's the Lightfoot story too. But as you're indicating, like, that message is the one that the Democrats are most uncomfortable about right now, because they have really plunked for like full-on abolitionism. And they've tried to say that they didn't, but they did. And they're on record saying these things, saying, like, you know, that the police are inherently racist and all these things, especially in 2020, some of the things that were said were absolutely egregious. So in that regard, yeah, there's like a lot of room for Republicans, if they're smart enough, to maneuver and say, yeah, these guys actually, the minute they get into a position of power, the minute things seem even relatively calm, like they have any wiggle room at all, they'll just go back to their sort of vested interest in reducing sentences and letting people run free, and just because it makes them look kind of trendy and compassionate or whatever. So yeah, it's kind of a fight between people's just inherent like collision with reality on the one hand, and really, you know, ironclad democratic grip on some of these cities on the other.
You know, it's like they would say about New York, if you make it here, you can make it anywhere. If you can break a city like New York, you can break anywhere. And the more that the people are concentrated into a handful of mega cities, and the more that the interior is depopulated and deindustrialized, the easier it is to get large numbers of people in those cities to go, you know, please, anything but this. There is an exhaustion that is just evident out on the streets of the big cities. It's just not a very aesthetic and cultured experience, and it's not, you know, as productive as it once was. There's a ton of downtown office space that is just sitting there, lying fallow in San Francisco and elsewhere. What is going to happen to that space? What is going to happen to the neighborhoods where the value of the real estate stacked up to the sky is going to just start approaching zero because they can't fill the space? This is, you know, there's a genuine prospect of real civil decay, civil unrest radiating out from those basically abandoned buildings, which are supposed to be the anchors of major metropolitan areas. And, you know, and that's before you start taking into account things like, well, you know, is there a bubble in the housing market? The charts don't look very good. Is there, you know, are we exposed to geopolitical risk in a way that is still not yet being priced in? Like, that seems reasonable at this point, and with, you know, with no end in sight to that risk being escalated by deliberate policy choices. And you know, if your goal is to reboot society on a new basis that you control, you know, these things are not all bad news. And so there's going to be a continued conflict over how exactly sovereignty is going to be recovered in America under digital conditions. The right has not done enough to understand the situation and present a real alternative to what is coming from the other side. Like, yes, we've seen some digital Bill of Rights stuff flying around. Something is assuredly better than nothing. But a lot of this stuff is framed where it's like, you know, it's all about big tech and how bad big tech is. And it's like, well, you know, guess how it got that way. It wasn't because people just really liked smartphones. I mean, obviously that was a factor, But how did you get big tech in the first place? Well, it was the Obama administration waving through every single merger and acquisition that came across its desk because, as a matter of national security and geopolitics, they wanted to build big tech. They wanted to use it as an instrument of statecraft, and that's exactly what happened. And here we are confronting the fact that all of our communications and economic activity has basically been centralized in the hands of a few institutions that are basically arms of the state. These institutions are at serious risk because if Taiwan gets taken off of their table, then there are going to start being major shortages of chips and motherboards and things that they desperately need. And all this stuff radiates all the way down toward the ordinary American who's not living out in the sticks. How those Americans are going to mobilize, you have 3 million, whatever it is, Trump voters in California, not effectively mobilized. And this pattern repeats itself elsewhere. So yeah, important to shed that spotlight on this latest cycle of decay in cities. But if there isn't a real alternative to what's being prepared for us, people are going to say, this sucks. Please just wipe it all away and replace it with something else.
So this is going to be the topic, basically, of our feature is like wither the American city. And James on our call earlier had a good question, which is like, okay, so we have this really appalling dysfunction in a lot of these big blue cities. San Francisco, I was just in Los Angeles returning, and there are areas that look like scenes out of The Last of Us. Like, it's not a joke that they've really let it get bad. You could rattle off a bunch of these. And then you have red state cities, which are, because of their success in some of these areas, they're receiving this rapid influx. I'm living in one. Here's Nashville. I myself, as one of the interlopers, have nevertheless started to feel like, wow, there's sure a lot of people coming into Nashville. It seems like maybe too fast. Maybe it's a problem. Miami is this way. Dallas are all facing some of these concerns at the same time as there's also a lot of promising stuff, I think, in the way that a city like, Miami is taking shape, the kind of hub it's become for like conservative activity. All this stuff is good to me, but there's problems there too. And so James was asking, like, is there anywhere that is just ticking along? Like, is there a good model for us to think about in 2023 with, when the problems, even if many of the dysfunctions have been around for a long time, as we've been discussing, the solutions to them may not look the same. They will certainly involve digital technology that they didn't involve before. I mean, when Giuliani was in office, CompStat was just getting started. Yeah, what do you guys think of? Are there any sort of hopeful models for what's the alternative to this disastrous, just like, cities kind of fall apart situation?
There are cities that haven't. I mean, Boston apparently doesn't have the same issues. I don't really know what they've been up to up there, but apparently they're not seeing like major rise in crime in the same way. I don't know. I mean, that's a great question. It seems to me that there are some pretty obvious things that you can do, like just enforce the law, don't allow people to set up tents, don't take the principle of harm reduction to the to its absurd end, which is like, you can't stop anyone from doing anything, so you need to let them do it and make it as easy for them to do it as possible. To the point where eventually you're just like handing out heroin in the library. And so, people can get it in a safe place. Don't defund your police, arrest shoplifters. I mean, I think it's not that complicated.
Right. Yeah, it seems like the problem is more, and this has been a theme of our conversation, it seems like a lot of the problem is more political than it is like theoretical in some sense. Like, we know what works on a lot of these issues. Politically, structurally, there are some hurdles. And that is what we are inviting authors to write about. So stay tuned at The American Mind. More stuff coming on this, AmericanMind.org. And I should say, Gotham is available for pre-order now. You can get it on iTunes, and it will be out March 21st. You can also go to the site and take a look at my interview with Matt. You will get plenty of good Seth Barron content if you watch the movie. you will also get some excellent background on the kind of long history of this stuff. Highly recommend it. Highly recommend checking out AmericanMind.org for the interview. And with that, I will move on to our section on reading the damn site. Once again, I wish to insist that you should go to AmericanMind.org and read pieces. And in order to make this as abundantly clear as possible, we have taken to picking our favorite pieces from the week, each week on the Roundtable. Mine this week has just gone up. In fact, I typed the URL into my search bar just now and found that it is on the front page. By the time you listen to this, it might not be first up on the front page anymore. But this is a piece called Human Matters. It's by Mary Harrington. Subtitle, The Conquest of the Body Has Not Been as Equitable as Advertised. And this is part of our ongoing feature on transhumanism, which we've been running for some time. Started with an excerpt from my book, How to Save the West, now has led us to the real, true OG, somebody I quote in the book, somebody who's been on this beat for a while, who has the really most granular and you might even say esoteric understanding of where a lot of this trans stuff, as we've been calling it, is going. Mary writes eloquently, she writes well, and she also picks up these really fascinating sources from the darkest reaches of the internet, where people say the quiet part out loud. They really say what they mean. She pulls in this piece of statement from the White House, an executive order, I think it is, about its intention to develop, I'm quoting here, genetic engineering technologies and techniques to be able to write circuitry for cells and predictably program biology in the same way in which we write software and program computers. That analogy between the software of the body and the software of the computer, it really rings a sinister note. Mary, much like another journalist we had on, Jennifer Bilek, I'm not sure how you say that, in this feature, does her homework about where the moneyed interests are in this, and leads us to the conclusion, I think the only right conclusion, that what we are witnessing here is the commoditization of human flesh by a certain elite of the masses. It is not the sort of thing that you want to play with. It is not the bright horizon of the future that you think you are moving toward. Human Matters by Mary Harrington really knocks it out of the park. And she's got a book out. It's called Feminism Against Progress. I think you can get it on Amazon now. I'm not sure if they're shipping to the States yet, but I think they are. So check that out as well. And just generally, if you don't know Mary Harrington, I cannot recommend it highly enough. What about you guys?
I like this piece, Anarchy in the CIA by Katja Sedgwick, all about how the CIA, I guess you saw that at South by Southwest, the CIA was down there, they had a recruiting station. She's saying, this is it started out, I guess, as a music festival, like a punk festival. In the old days, the punks hated the CIA, and, they hated the military. They were rebels, revolutionaries. But now, punk, the counterculture, like we were saying, I think last week, or maybe we weren't, but you can shave your head, you can have a mohawk, you can have a thing through your nose, whatever, like Sam Brinton, and totally fit in at the CIA or the the Nuclear Regulatory Agency or McKinsey or wherever.
Right.
They're fine with all that. Yeah. So, and she has some funny things, like quoting Henry Rollins from Black Flag, saying, I think Dr. Fauci has my back. I'm really happy about Dr. Fauci, and just all this kind of funny stuff. What does it mean to be counterculture nowadays? Whatever. It's a good piece.
Yeah, I like that. The bland, banal, head shaving and tattooing and piercing. This is something that even Midge Decter sort of talks about in that essay that I keep obsessing over about Fire Island and commentary, where she's like, at a certain point when this stuff gets politically co-opted, it just becomes incredibly drab. And yeah, what does it really mean to rebel? It's not as advertised. Anyway, James, what's your
Mark Barwellline has a great little piece called The Real Defenders of Academic Freedom, and it concerns the blowback, the inevitable blowback denunciations of the New College of Florida for daring, the temerity to roll back DEI as it is now known, because DIE just didn't work for people. On campus, canceling diversity statements in faculty hiring, eliminating mandatory diversity training for staff, reviewing all of our quote unquote diversity activities on campus. He's one of the trustees at the new college. And if you've been following the story, none of this will surprise you, but you will still want to read it. It's just clear that established academia has adopted a creed that is spelled out in exacting detail, and which is to be adopted by every single institution of higher learning that hopes to be accredited. The new college in Florida is distinguishing itself as really the only, or at least the first, institution of higher ed that is just going to go after this root and branch. And Bauerlein points out that what is going to come back in instead is material that, and this is just a quote, that conservatives and liberals not too long ago admired equally and unambiguously. Immersion in great books, great ideas, great events of the Western tradition, heritage that's given us the U.S. Constitutions, Beethoven's Fifth, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so, yes, this will be quite the experiment, and we will be watching this one closely as results unfold. It's, I don't think, too much to hope that imitators will be spawned, and I think that's just what is feared on the other side. So Bauerlein closes with a line: the eradication of DEI should not be a DeSantis brand, not only, but rather a national project. I'm sure that more or less everyone listening in is going to agree with that. So if you want to watch the leading edge of that project, that's the piece to read.
Absolutely. Yeah. The first of all, I don't know why DIE flopped as an acronym. It's a mystery, but the new college program is just one of those things where he's doing it. He's making a shot at it. They are making a shot at it. And there is definitely a danger among a certain stripe of Republicans, I think, to say, oh, no, we got what we wanted, and it's not right, or we don't want to do it again, because that would be uncivil. This is absolutely the model. It ought to be the procedure for any Republican in any amount of power over this stuff. I just think it's a really hopeful sign. And with that, we are going to close. One more time, it's AmericanMind.org to get all of those pieces and more. And we thank you for listening to the Roundtable. If you want to learn more about all the stuff we do at Claremont, we've got a bunch of places to send you. First of all, there's ClaremontReviewBooks.com and Claremont.org. I've already talked ad nauseum about AmericanMind.org, which is our site. You can also donate to support the work that we do in defense and recovery of the American idea at Claremont.org/donate. There is an opportunity when you do that to be mentioned on the show, not a requirement of making a donation. If you prefer to remain anonymous, we support that as well. But we will always happily shout you out if you ask to be shouted out and you give a donation directly aimed at Roundtable and American Mind. We have all sorts of projects going on that we sort of mentioned, but I'm just going to leave it at that now. We've talked about Gotham. We've talked about my book and Mary Harrison's book. Thank you to our production crew, which today is Blaze Ebner. And thanks to you all for listening. We will talk to you next week.